This episode of The Clear Out was recorded on the 23rd of May 2024 at home in Wicklow, and it is a continuation of my series on masculinity. And this week the focus is on crying, male crying. And the episode begins with a very recent reason I was given to cry my eyes out. And I did. I'll tell you all about it when you listen, and that will lead me on to the larger thesis of what I think is one of the main areas of concern in the lives of men, which is the very compromised, very conflicted area of male emotional expression and the lack of spaces given to men to express their emotional lives, which I think causes enormous damage to men and to their relationships, the people who care about them, to society, and so on. It just filters out further and further and further. So that's it. That is the main focus of today's episode. Late being released this week for reasons due to related to health, and my apologies for that. But I think quite a good episode. Only one way to find out if my claim is true. Get into it. Get listening. I will see you around the corner. Cheers.
Ooh, not gonna change my mind, leaving the dream behind, keep my emoji inside.
Hi, my name is Dara Clear, and you're listening to The Clear Out. You're very welcome. I hope this finds you well. And I apologise for the delay in the release of this episode. For those of you who may be among the first 10 or 12 listeners each week who seem to download it after its normal time of release, I've been sick. You can hear it still in my voice. I'm somewhat under the weather physically, but I can assure you this is much better than I sounded 24 hours ago. And the reason is the women in my life, my wife and daughter. They've been sick for the last week and a half, longer. And I was surviving quite well. Indeed. My immune system being that much stronger. But then something happened. And that something was just under a week ago. We had to say goodbye to our beloved cat, Marlon. Marlon, who I think I'd mentioned in recent episodes. Marlon just turned 22. Monday of last week, she turned 22. That is an old cat. That was an old cat. And she had been on a very evident decline in the last couple of months. And the decline was getting steeper and faster. And my wife and I decided, and we consulted with Maeve, our daughter. We didn't consult her opinion, but just, included her in the conversation. We decided that the most humane thing to do would be to have Marlon put to sleep at the local vet. And that's what we did Friday of last week. And it was brutal. Not the act itself. It was as we anticipated. It was humane. It was peaceful. Although apparently the vet told us when they put the cannula in her emaciated paw that she gave them a bit of a battle. And that would have been a characteristic of Marlon. She was feisty. She was full of attitude. She was a quirky cat, and I remember when I sort of hatched the plan to get my wife a cat 22 years ago. My wife was a little bit low. There was a bit of drama happening in her band at the time. She was just back from a trip to Australia, my first visit out to meet her family. And we were back in Ireland, and there was a bit of, stress, and she was feeling a bit flat. And knowing how much of a cat lover she was, and I was very well disposed towards cats myself, I concocted a plan upon seeing an ad in the window of the vets advertising kittens looking for homes, and I persuaded my wife to take me for a driving lesson. I wasn't driving at the time, and we took a spin out the countryside and along the coast, and I pretended there was a house my parents used to visit when we were kids, and I wanted to see it. So we pulled into this house. It was clearly a relatively new house. There was no way it had existed when I was a kid. And a woman came out and gave me a wave, and my wife's like, okay, what's going on here? And the woman beckoned us around the back of the house where there was a little utility room, and we walked in there, and there was a mother cat and about 6 or 7 kittens all scrambling around. And the jig was up. My wife knew what was going on, and she immediately picked up this incredibly demure black kitten, completely docile and biddable and purring and all the rest, and she was like oohing and ahhing. But I clocked just my my martial arts training. I sensed a disruption in the force. And I saw this little sort of quirky, twitching, slightly lunatic kitten in the corner, swiping at the air. And I thought, that's the one. And I picked the kitten up, and I said, this is it. This is going to be our cat. And so we got the kitten, this little ball of energy and feistiness and quirkiness. I just felt a total kindred spirit. I'd met my soulmate in feline form, and I was in the passenger seat, not being a driver, and I held the kitten up and said, "You shall be called Marlon." And yes, after Marlon Brando, just because a good name and a nice reference point and one of my favourite actors. And we took Marlon home, and within a couple of days, we got Marlon to the vet, and we're told Marlon is a girl. And that was like, okay, no problem. And I have mentioned this before. I have a history in my own family of, gender neutral names for cats, or, misgendering cats. So my favourite one, of course, is this big burly tomcat we had, who was called Genevieve. Anyway, that was Marlon. And Marlon was just this fun and feisty and scratchy, bitey, hissy, pissy cat that was our faithful. I mean, is any cat really faithful? Just our ever-present cat, who, was central to our existence, central to wherever we lived. Marlon has lived in every home that my wife and I have been in together. And obviously we took her out to Melbourne with us. So she spent 10 years in Melbourne with us, which included time in quarantine, which included time in a cat motel in Brunswick, a very funky and cool part of Melbourne, and eventually found her way to our home where we were for the entire time in Melbourne, on Cheeseman Avenue, and was there for Maeve's arrival and was Maeve's forever pet. And, she got older and she started to fade. Like, there's no question, she made the trip alone back from Australia to here, arriving several months. We got here in April when we came back from Australia at the start of the pandemic. We arrived back in April 2020. And I don't think we got Marlon for another 2 or 3 months before she arrived, just with all the delays. And I was very grateful to my friend Tim Fry and his then girlfriend. They looked after Marlon really well in near Flemington in Melbourne, and kept her safe and loved, and were able to accommodate the changed schedule because of the pandemic. But Marlon eventually got back to us and arrived safe and sound, and just extraordinarily resilient cat. But I think particularly over the last year, her decrepitude and the signs of wear and tear, the attritional nature of aging just began to make itself more felt, and she was sort of more and more withdrawn, and her world was gradually and then ever faster getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And there was a sense of, we projected a certain amount of dementia, a loss of bearings, not being sure where she was. I did report at one point on the podcast where she had a spell, I can't remember if it was earlier this year or late last year, where she was just peeing in all the wrong places. It was last year, because I know she found some sort of well or recess in the vacuum cleaner and peed there, so the vacuum cleaner would stink of cat piss when we were using it. Oh man. So, but yeah, and there was just so many indications that she just wasn't a well cat. And even though my wife had her at the vet about 5 weeks ago, and the vet was like, her heart is really strong, which is there's something I find so beautiful about that, that the heart of all things remained really healthy and well. And this is also a cat who survived a horrendous and still unknown or unidentified infection in Melbourne. We thought we'd given her cancer, like skin cancer, within the first 18 months of being in Australia because of, the changed climate. Because every summer she used to get this awful infection in her nose and would flare up and be just gross. And, we had to then, medicate her every summer to calm her nose down. And, she had a little biopsy taken off it and all kinds of things. But again, a survivor. And last Friday was the day we booked the appointment, and I was here on my own with her last Friday, and I was trying to do some work. I was trying to study this course I'm doing at the moment on men's studies, and she wasn't having a great day. She was quite vocal and meowing, and her vision had really deteriorated. Her sense of smell seemed to be good, but just this thing of like walking in circles and then just being, stopping and staring into space or staring in front of a cupboard door, struggling to find the kitty litter, all of that. And the only time I felt calm observing her was when she was asleep. And eventually she did kind of go to her bed, and I just went over to have a word with her, and just found myself crying, fat tears just falling in front of her, just knowing what was coming and looking at her going, she's no idea that we're about to, send her to the great kitty litter in the sky. And it came to pass. My wife was working and she met me at the vet, and oh man, I was unprepared. I mean, I knew I'd be upset. I knew I would be upset. But the wrench of seeing the life leave her body once she was given her sort of her lethal injection, which is fundamentally an overdose of anaesthetic. It was just heartbreaking. My poor wife just dissolved and just broke. And, again, I suppose, I wasn't like, making any kind of strong decisions about my own emotional response, but it felt it wasn't going to do us much good if we were both just lying in a pool of tears in the little, surgery. So I was kind of keeping my own stuff together. A certain amount. I was crying, but it was a bit more contained, a bit more stoic, if you want to put that word on it. But it was awful. And I mean, my reflection was like, oh my God, like this little living being who's been, such an important part of our lives for so long, and is now just gone. And I think this is, it's true for any type of bereavement, human or pet or whatever. And it's, what you're left with is the space left behind. And it's kind of shocking and dissonant and disruptive and incredibly painful. And I think there's obviously there's a hierarchy of rightful grieving, or a hierarchy where people will go, well, yeah, that's appropriate to grieve for your spouse, or a parent, or a close family member, or a good friend. And then, there's definitely a pecking order. Like, there's a ranking. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, definitely you can grieve for your dog. Your cat, I suppose, like quite close. I mean, people definitely, my sense is, when we moved to Australia, there was such reaction to us going, oh yeah, we're going to take our cat. And I feel like if it had been a dog, people would have been, of course you'll take your dog. But people are like, what in God's name are you doing bringing your cat? So there's this kind of strange double standard that can be applied. But we were like, if you can't guarantee the pet that you allegedly love, if you can't guarantee them the same quality of life, you can't leave them behind. If there's not someone who can give them the same level of care and accommodate their personality and whatnot, it's just kind of, I think it's immoral. I think it's kind of unethical to to discard them. And then you kind of go further down the list, different kinds of pets. Like when we left Australia, we had to get rid of a few fish from a recently given aquarium. I was like, I don't want this bloody aquarium. You know what? I didn't lose a beat over those fish. And you've heard me talk this year about guinea pigs being rehomed. You've heard me talk about the chickens recently, the recently murdered chickens, being gone. Not that painful. Guinea pigs, cute, but we weren't close. Funny to look at, but we weren't close. And even though Marlon had become less close just because of her diminished capacity, she was much less interactive. Although only a few weeks ago she was still at the dinner table. She used to jump up on a chair when we were having dinner, and I'd kind of angrily push the chair far away so she couldn't be annoying me by kind of putting her paw on my arm or on the table to get a bit of whatever I was having. I mean, literally, I think she was still doing that 3 or 4 weeks ago at the longest. And then suddenly that she wasn't jumping up on that chair anymore. But yeah, my rational thoughts were, when someone lives with you, it doesn't matter, animal or human. If you're open, if part of your sort of Your psyche, and I think it's quite subconscious. Part of your sort of psyche is basically going, yeah, that presence is very much a part of this world. And the word I like to use is the ecosystem. It's like the ecosystem of our family, these different animals. Marlon was such an important part of that. And I think what happens is, when you live with a living being, human or animal, for a long time, all your rhythms, they find a harmonious way of attuning and being together. And there's a real natural, energetic accommodation of that living being. And it just makes sense. It makes sense that they're there. It makes sense. And that doesn't mean like it's all good all the time. It doesn't mean there weren't times I would be frustrated with that cat. Doesn't mean that there haven't been times in the history of that cat's lifetime where I wasn't kicking it out the door. It doesn't mean that I one time didn't leave my house in Melbourne not long after we moved in with Marlon to go and find her and knock her out of a tree with a brush because she crossed a very busy main road. And I was like, get your ass back in the house, pussycat. And there were many incidents like that over the years when she was still an able-bodied cat with a taste for adventure. But this is the resettling, and this is the reconstruction, and this is the realignment. When you go, how do we live now with this little entity gone, with this life force gone, and how do I live with what it has cost me? How do I live with the grief? And the grief was intense. And my wife and I were back here last Friday afternoon with Marlon's dead body. And we were just bereft. And it was, again, I was definitely being more stoic and, just sort of caressing this dead pussycat who my wife had, very nicely wrapped in a lovely pink blanket and placed a little rose on her chest. And, her body was still warm. And of course, over time, that body just gets colder and colder and stiffens up. But it was incredibly painful. And at one point, it must have been only within a couple of hours of being back from the vet, my wife asked me to get some incense from the kind of the home office where I am now recording. And I came down to this room, and I just entered the room, and I didn't make it as far as the desk to get the incense because I just collapsed. And I went down on my knees and I just sobbed. And oh my goodness, one of those, shoulder heaving, chest heaving fits of crying. And it was overwhelming. And I had another, I went back out with the incense. I had another one then, just at my, again, on my knees, my head beside, on the couch beside where my wife was holding Marlon. And it was full on. And I'm talking about this for two reasons. One, it's relevant to me because it's a big event in my life. And it just happened, and it still feels very raw and very painful, and weird and surreal. And we did give Marlon a hero's burial 2 days later. We took her over to my parents' house, and I dug a grave for her up on a bank above my parents' house beneath an oak tree, which I thought was great because that's what my name means. For people who don't know Irish, Dara, the name, it means of the oak tree. And so I always feel a particular affinity for the oak. And it just felt, this is nice. I like this. And we dug her a grave. My brother Danny made her a beautiful little cross with a couple of branches off a tree and just notched them together. And we said our goodbyes, and there are other family pets buried up there in that similar area of my parents' place. And that just it just felt okay. That's good. That's that's appropriate. It brings this initial part of the process to a close, and this is also part of the first part of why I'm talking about this. A little epilogue to it was my daughter was fundamentally, and we all had been to an extent, but it kind of in denial about the whole thing. And when she came home from a play date late on Friday, she showed very little interest in what had happened. Saturday, I had her out doing a big obstacle course event not far from here with a good friend, and it was a big fun day of hanging out, and that was all fine. And again, very little interest expressed or thoughts about the cat. And then Sunday the same, and I was like, okay, I was a little bit wary, I suppose is the word. As I think I was just like, okay, I'm not sure what this is about. It feels a bit off. But then on Sunday night, I was at my computer in one room, and again, like a spider sense that parents have, I just went, no, hold on, something's up. And I just paused. I could hear my daughter just quietly crying in the other room. She was by herself, just head in her knees and arms wrapped around herself, and it kind of, she finally let it in. And she was just inconsolable. And sadly for her, that's how she went to sleep that night, just crying and thinking of our little friend that we had to say goodbye to. So, and you may or may not be able to hear it in my voice. I mean, I'm just about keeping it together as I share this story back with you. But the second reason I'm telling you this is because this episode is part 3 of my exploration, interrogation, reflection on masculinity. And I think that talking about crying is a great place to start this third part of this discussion. And the idea of a man crying over his dead pussycat is, and I use pussycat, that's deliberate, that's not an accidental choice. This big ball of fluff who'd given me so much joy and happiness and, aggravation and confrontation. This was a cat who would so often seek out cuddles and then be deeply resentful when you gave them to her, and get pissed off and hiss and try and scratch you before jumping off your lap. And our cat Ruby, who remains intact and has just had her 3rd birthday. Ruby's the opposite. Ruby almost never seeks out a cuddle, but I've never known a cat to receive a cuddle so well once you have her. She's just like, yeah, she's just like, yeah, give it to me, baby. Give me everything you've got. But yeah, I just think, in last week's episode, I looked very much at, straight masculinity as it plays out in movies. And it was almost exclusively Hollywood movies. And I pitched that exploration of straight male stories in movies along three main ideas of like potency or impotency, action, or the willingness to use violence or not, and morality, immorality. But very, a very sort of hetero straight lens. The vast majority of the characters I referred to kind of fell into that camp. There were a couple of exceptions. Lawrence Fishburne from Boys in the Hood, the black alumni who come to the rescue of the nerds in Revenge of the Nerds, the old kind of fraternity brothers. I also referred to William Hurt's gay/trans character in Kiss of the Spider Woman. But otherwise, predominantly very straight male characterizations and representations of masculinity. William Hurt was a sort of a counterpoint to a different version of masculinity that was very popular in the 80s. Well, certainly in his roles, he was a very successful actor, presenting a different version of masculinity. And so, today's episode, my general thrust was, what does counter masculinity look like? And this idea of men who cry being unmasculine, I thought was a good place to start. And so I'll try and, as usual, I'll try and thread the needle and keep things reasonably coherent as I do this. But I'll be referencing a couple of different articles that I've read, as well as sharing my own thoughts, because largely my experience has, my experience culturally speaking, and from a sort of a nurture point of view, has fallen, into pretty conventional reference points. In terms of straight masculinity. I did mention in the first part of this how my own background was very much informed by my parents' hippie lifestyle and leftist liberal leanings, socially, culturally, politically, and that definitely informed certain ideas of masculinity I had, and what my father embodied in terms of his masculinity had a huge influence on my concept of a masculinity that I find attractive. But like around me, amongst my peers, in particularly in secondary school, high school, I think a lot of guys were performing masculinity in very conventional ways, in very conventional straight male ways, and I'll kind of talk a little bit about that today, referring to a couple of articles. And definitely I want to lean into one of my prevailing theories of masculinity, and one of the major areas of conflict and compromise and struggle for not just for straight men, but I think for all men. But it has a very masculine frame and a very sort of masculine performance frame. And that theory, very simply, is that there is little to no social, cultural space made for the emotional lives of men. That's it. That's my theory. And I think it leads to enormous damage in men, and it leads to enormous pressure in men. And the invalidation of the emotional lives of men begins at a very, very young age with 3 simple words. And those words are: boys don't cry. It's simple, isn't it? Boys don't cry. Boys are rewarded for being stoic, They're rewarded for being resilient. They're rewarded for being tough. They're rewarded for being non-demonstrative. They're rewarded for not being affectionate. They're rewarded for not being emotional. And it's all part of being tougher, stronger, and in one way or another, it's part of being weaponized as a young man and as a boy. So to a certain age, it's permissible for boys to cry, and then it's not. And I'm sure I read in last week in an academic paper that, like, I think it's around 14 is the cutoff. So up until then it might be tolerated. I'm sure it has to be younger than that when it's actively discouraged. But that idea is so pervasive and so influential on the kind of psychology of boys and young men, and the way models of masculinity are laid out for them. It can only lead to a very conflicted and compromised relationship with the demonstration or the expression of vulnerability. And is there anything more vulnerable than crying? I mean, apart from being stripped naked and forced to stand amongst your peers with no clothes on. I mean, that's a very clunky alternative to crying being the most vulnerable thing. But the act of crying is, I suppose it's, and this is something I came across in an academic paper this week. There are studies. There have been studies on crying. I read one of them this week, and the idea of crying in public as opposed to crying privately. So crying with someone you know or crying with people you know, that's a different experience. It's more acceptable. Crying by yourself privately is also more acceptable. Both are more acceptable than crying in public. So crying in public brings a different kind of pressure. Maybe it has more of a stigma attached to it. We have certain understandings around crying in public, and again, these are sort of psychological, psychosocial understandings of zones and where it is appropriate to do things and where it is not appropriate to do things. And so crying definitely falls into that structure of understanding human interaction. So crying, who's allowed to do it, who's not allowed to do it? Little babies and little children, no problem. There's an assumption that women will be more comfortable with crying. Some of the research bears this out. 5 times more often, twice as long is one thing I read. And if there's also maybe a perception that, for women to cry, that's, natural for the female psyche, natural for feminine performance. Something to do with women being softer, something to do with women being more open, more emotionally communicative, more emotional in general. Also a perception maybe that women have greater peer support and peer approval amongst their own sex, I think would be a perception that is also out there. And what about men? What about boys and men? When is it appropriate for them to cry? You can have a stoic cry at a funeral, perhaps. Men, hilariously, are definitely permitted to cry at sports events. So, you can cry when your team does well. You can cry when, so many different sporting contexts. As a fan, men will be weeping openly. But that can also be, when your team fails, tears of despair. You see footballers cry all the time, particularly when they've just lost a final. Something I have familiarity with as a Spurs fan. That's not the San Antonio Spurs for American listeners. That's Tottenham Hotspur, the wonderful North London football team from the English Premier League. A team that has given me a lot of ups and downs through my life. I'm trying to think if I've cried over my football team. I cried when we got into the final of the Champions League in 2019. Oh my God, what a moment that was! But we qualified for the final in such dramatic fashion, with late winning goals from the Brazilian player Lucas Moura. It was thrilling, and I mean that's obviously the thrill of sport. But personally, I am a crier. My daughter's always slagging me off because I cry at movies all the time. And I think this is something I've spoken about before. Certain times of the day, like I'm definitely more susceptible to a little cry early in the morning. I'm a bit more open. I'm a bit more susceptible. Maybe a bit more suggestible. So anything could make me cry. An ad, something I'm looking at on Instagram. Often it's acts of human kindness, human decency. It's very sentimental stuff. I mean, I cried earlier this year when I came across the clip of Jurgen Klopp meeting a young Northern Irish kid with some quite serious physical disability, who Klopp had seen in a clip crying upon a visit to Liverpool, and Klopp was so impressed by this kid that he invited him over for a personal meeting and tour of Anfield, Liverpool's home ground. And of course it's all PR, and it's a good news story for Liverpool fans, Jurgen Klopp. But I tell you what, I found it very, very, very moving. Like, Klopp just came across like such a decent guy, and spoke with real eloquence about the validity of being an emotional person and an emotional man. And as it happened by coincidence, the kid's name was also Dara. That wasn't, that's just an extra. That's just an extra little, sprinkle of magic dust on the story. But I mean, similar to this idea that I mentioned before of like a hierarchy of grieving, a rating system for, that's permissible. That's permissible, a permissible level of grief. Like, I'd have a very, very clear idea in my mind of, a very clear memory in my mind of the big crying events in my life. Because there's different levels of crying. So, I cry easily at movies. I kind of give myself over. I'll cry easily at those little kind of human interest stories. I cry easily at that stuff. Very easily moved. I've said before, well-told, well-made movies featuring scenes between fathers, brothers, that can really open me up. I think of the scene in Bradley Cooper's A Star Is Born, where towards the end of the film, he's had this very tumultuous period in the movie in his relationship with his older brother, played by Sam Elliott. And Sam Elliott is giving Cooper's character a lift home after Cooper's come out of rehab, and he's been through a really rocky spell. And they've had this very volatile, some very volatile episodes in the lead up to getting into rehab. And, Cooper just has this little kind of almost thrown away, but deeply personal, open moment with his brother. And basically says, that it was him. He was the one that he really loved, admired, looked up to. It was him that was the role model, not their father. And it's very well. It's a very well crafted scene. It's very short. As I say, it's almost thrown away. And of course, that captures this sort of, the difficulty men have in communicating openly. And Sam Elliott, the camera stays with Sam Elliott in the back of his car, his truck, as he reverses out of the drive. But as he turns back to look out, to look out his back window to reverse, his eyes are just full of tears, and you can see all the all the repressed emotion and where Cooper's words have just landed. I think it's really powerful and very, very, very believable, very true. And it speaks to something. I responded to it because that speaks to something in me. Because it's I'd recognise the lack of a clean channel, a clear channel between myself and my three brothers in terms of being able to speak like that to each other. And so it's it hits in very particular places depending on how much time you reflect on that. And yeah, in any case, what I was trying to say was I have really clear memories of, I don't know, let me think, 7 or 8 times in my life that I've had those real shoulder shaking cries, those real, whoa, this grief, this emotion is coming from a completely different place. This is not, my team has just got into the Champions League final. This is not, I just saw a really cool scene in a movie I really like and it was very moving. These are cries that come from a very different place. They are primal. They are central to who I am as a person. They are central to very deep parts of my belief system about myself. They're connected to very deep parts of what I believe about how I'm valued, cared, loved for. They're connected to very deep parts of how I feel about other people, or in this case with my cat, how I feel about a cat. And 8, I haven't stopped and thought and counted them all out, but off the top of my head I'd say there have been 8, and I know that there have been 2 this year, one for Marlon last Friday and one early this year when I was having a really, really low spell of very poor mental health, definitely a bit of a crisis, a bit of burnout. I spoke about this very openly and clearly earlier in the year. And a very nice thing my daughter said to me that I subsequently relayed to my wife completely opened me up when I referred to it in talking to my wife. And they were tears for me. They were tears for myself. And again, in the context of masculinity, I don't know if that would not be a very masculine thing to do. Go, yeah, I cried for myself. I cried for me, for my pain, for my anguish, for my emotional distress, for my sense of being lost, or my own sense of deep personal failure, or whatever. And I really value those moments. Like for me, they are high points in my life, not low points. Because for me, those tears earlier this year, the demonstration of care for myself, that's very profound for me. That's very profound for me to kind of go, oh, I value myself. I had to hear something from my daughter to contextualize that and to open up that channel for myself. But that's very valuable to me. And, to cry for my cat, to acknowledge, again, it's an acknowledgement of care, it's an acknowledgement of love, it's a validation of connection to another being. A friend sent me a very nice text simply saying, a soul is a soul is a soul. And he added more to that, but like that validation of living things, and that this is not a place I spend a lot of time living in. I'm not going out there going, don't step on the worm. Oh my God, it's a fly. Release it. Don't kill it. Listen, I've killed plenty of flies. No problem. I'm not, again, this comes back to my own sort of concept of masculinity. There's a certain amount of moderation. Let's not go too far, one way or another. But other big cries I've had have been for, different of my brothers in jeopardy, in bad situations. Sometimes it's delayed grief or concern. Sometimes it's instant. Grief for bereavements, family members who've died, close friends who've died. And, I guess I'm lucky maybe on one level that there's been, there's only been 7 or 8 or 9 of these moments. But that's across a long time as well. So I think the first one I can think of, I was only 17. And that was, again, something within the family, something about I was in my first year of university. I was feeling very alienated and estranged within my own family. And just a lot of stuff came out in a point of conflict with my mother. And, again, 17, just about to turn 18. I was a kid and just completely overwhelmed with my sense of rejection. There's a lot of good reasons for that, by the way. But I'm not here to litigate that. I'm not here to litigate the righteousness of my cause. But I remember the tears. I remember the crying, and being comforted by my mother. There was much more to come in that story over time, but it was a key moment at the time, and yeah. So the larger point I'm trying to get to is this advocacy for crying? Yeah, on one level it is. Get it out, let the feeling out, find that release, find that channel, find the context, the setting, the circumstances that allow you, if you're a man, that allow you to release that sadness, that pain, that frustration, that whatever it might be. And, the thing is, I'd feel that for anyone. I'd advocate that for anyone, not just for men. But, the focus is on men in these current episodes. And arguably men need it more. Arguably, women have plenty of advocates, and have different fights to fight, different reasons for their own sense of, being wronged, or their own sense of not being given space to do different things, and that might not be in the same area as men feel that. Again, I'm reluctant to open that door because it's a much wider discussion. But I mean, fundamentally, my position would be, do not underestimate the emotional richness of men. I mean, that's really it. Do not underestimate the emotional lives of men, the emotional intensity of male interiority. Don't reduce men to being these sort of desensitized, clumsy, physical men children who don't have emotional vitality or emotional vibrancy. I think, you know, all the men in my life are intensely emotional people. I know they are. Now, there might be different levels of the demonstration of that. But it just seems so absurd to me. Like, absurd, illogical, so counter to the evidence that's been in front of me my entire life to suggest that men are not emotional beings and don't need space to accommodate that, to express that, that don't need permission to validate that, that wouldn't benefit from being given that permission, that wouldn't benefit from being able to express that and negotiate that with greater ease and greater approval, socially, culturally, personally. I remain convinced that enormous parts of male behaviour that continues to cause justified concern, whether that's in areas of violence, whether that's in areas of misogyny, sexism, different forms of abuse, addiction, social disruption, whatever it might be. I remain convinced that huge, a huge part of that dysfunction and disproportional behaviour is connected to thwarted emotional lives, thwarted emotional expression, and emotional invalidation. I mean, again, go back to the history of this podcast. The history, by the way, is nearly 3 years old now. The podcast will be officially 3 years old in 4 days' time. So an early happy birthday to the podcast. Hip hip hooray, said one person. Me. Yeah, there's an episode. There's an episode where I talk about the way sick men are dismissed. Men with the man cold, man flu. And my argument in an earlier episode was, if a man gets dismissed, slagged off, made fun of, reduced to a punchline because he's genuinely unwell, okay, with something that isn't life-threatening, how is he meant to say, I feel really sad inside, I feel rejected, I feel like I have no purpose, I feel pointless, I feel inadequate, I don't feel like I'm a good man? Can you make the connection between those two things? Like, I think this is really serious stuff. I don't think it's light. I think there's nothing more serious when I think about men's issues. Because it all starts so young. It all starts so young. And when you have a concept as strong and as the word I used was pervasive, it's widespread, it's insidious, that idea of boys don't cry, that's really where it begins. And you've got to ask yourself, how comfortable are you with other people crying? That's a question for men and women, whoever. I remember being in Melbourne, working in a language school, and there was a female member of staff who, there's no two ways about it. She was a really toxic ingredient in that staff. She was bad news. On my first day, she pulled me aside and went into a expletive-filled rant, bitching about like several members of the staff, including management. And I was like, what is going on with this person? And then as I got to know her more, I realised she was a pretty chaotic individual. And she came in one morning to work and she was an absolute mess and had been through some major personal drama with her family, and just came in and she looked disastrous and was complete, physical mess, and was just, oversharing all this information in our tiny staff room. And then she just sort of dissolved into tears, sobbing. And I just did a quick scan of the room, and it was really clear that no one in the room, there were men and women there, male and female members of staff, male and female colleagues. And I just felt their attitude was like, they were just like, just get the hell out of here, lady. We're not interested in this messy crap. And, I knew who she was. I knew there were so many elements of what she was presenting that, much of it was possibly not true, that it was very much a narrative that she was spinning in her favour. But I still reached out to her and just held her and gave her a big hug to let her sort of have her moment of purging the sobs. Because I'm not threatened by somebody crying. It depends on the person. I made a call in that moment. That to me still felt like the more humane thing to do than to just ignore her, which seems to be the response of other members of the staff who are just trying to prepare for class. And sure enough, subsequently, in that same school, I'm sure I became persona non grata with this same woman for, I don't know what I did. Anyway, nothing inappropriate, I can assure you, but I know I was on her shit list not very long after that. Anyway, grand. But you know what I mean? Like that thing of, like, I look at someone crying and I go, yeah, it's just human emotion. Is that something that scares you? Because like anger is human emotion. Laughter, joy is human emotion. Is resentment an emotion? Jealousy, resentment, bitching, it's kind of an emotion. There's anger in that. To me, it's all natural. It's all part of the picture. And yeah, sure, there are different contexts. And my telling you about my former colleague, like there was an example of she's crying in public. People do not want this. This is a very awkward situation for a lot of people. And I just go, oh, look, whatever, just give her a hug. That'll help her. That'll help calm this situation down. It'll give her a response that allows her to move on with her day. There's a human response to that as well, that I'm like, that's also important to me for my own self-respect. So, again, come back to men and what men need. I believe that's a huge part of what men need, because I think the refusal of permission to men to have emotional lives results in huge pressure, enormous, almost unbearable internal pressure that obviously it gets funneled into other areas. And if you think there's not a relationship between that and some men's relationship to alcohol, drugs, other things that they do, other addictive behaviours. I mean, my wife would probably look at me and go, my relationship to staying well is a type of addiction. I'd go, yeah. I think I've spoken about that. I think I've put my hand up to that before. Because that is, it's definitely one of my main coping mechanisms to deal with my own emotional life. And I suppose I kind of offset it and go, well, it's either, I do this and try and keep myself well, keep my head on my shoulders and keep my emotional life in check and regulated by giving myself a healthy physical focus, rather than turning to a bottle or other, less healthy behaviours. So crying part of that. I think at different times of your life, you need it more. And that's the thing that I've been, learning about, masculinity as well. Like, masculinity, it lives on a timeline. It lives in history. Masculinity has, different behaviours are acceptable or given space at different times in history. And of course it changes from culture to culture. I remember another friend of mine talking about how he spent time in Russia, and he said, like, in Russian culture, Russian masculinity, smiling is perceived as weakness. Whistling is perceived as idiocy. Whistling in public, it's like you're mentally retarded if you're, whistling to yourself walking down the street. And again, the performed masculinity that I received growing up in my part of Ireland, there was an element of that. There was an element of, you maintain a front. And I've always sort of champed against that. I just don't like the sort of, sometimes there's a self-seriousness of performed masculinity that I just go, this is fucking absurd. I'm just like, stop. Again, context. So, humour has always been a huge part of my approach to, let's not take ourselves too seriously. There has to be a release valve here. And, I still do that. That's still part of how I try to kind of undercut the puffed up chest, and undercut the build up of a certain kind of energy. Okay, well, look, I'm going to throw in a couple of links to crying, to articles I read on crying, which will give you references to historical precedents for men crying when it was still very much an accepted thing. And I don't know if it was in one of those articles that I read, but there was one interesting thing I read about how capitalism and industrialization played its part in refusing men permission to cry. Refusing men to have emotional lives because it would take them away from their work. If you have men kind of walking off the production line to go, Mary said something very hurtful to me last night and I'm feeling really upset about it. That's less dollars. That hits the bottom line. So it's, suck it up, get on with your work. That's in the mix as well. That's an interesting thing. And of course, so many of us, can use, work can be this great distraction, this great place to sort of subsume ourselves and our emotional lives, and just deflect and pull the focus away. And that can be a really healthy thing. And when I'm immersed in certain kinds of work, that can work for me as well. But again, for me, it's like balance. That's fine. Like, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that, of course. But are you tuned in as a man, as a young man, as an older man? Are you tuned in to what you need emotionally? And how are you going to express that? How are you going to communicate that? Who are you going to communicate it with? Where are you going to communicate it with? Do you have to wait until you're drunk at, a closing time to tell your friends you love them? For example. And this isn't, I'm not obsessed with the whole drink thing, but, that's... If that's an emotion you need to express love. I mean, I've tried to tap into that more and more, as over the last 15 years, 20 years, follow that positive impulse. Don't go to the grave thinking, I wish I'd told such and such. I wish I told him that I loved him. I wish I told her that I loved her. I wish I'd expressed that positive emotion. And, particularly the expression of positive emotions. I think that's very empowering. And the more ease you have with expressing positive emotions, I think the more confidence you have then expressing the negative ones in healthy ways. When there's fracture, and when there's hurt, and when there's, injury in relationships. So, start with the positive ones. It's easier to say something nice than not. But it opens up a channel. And, this is what I've put value in my male friendships and male relationships over the years. The opening up of the channel of, this is a safe space. Again, something I've spoken about before on the podcast. A safe emotional space. You can be yourself here. You can be open. And I can think of, I don't know, at least 3, 4, 5 of my male friends in the history of my relationships who I've held in my arms while they've cried. Very personal stuff, personal fractures, hurts, wounds, whatever. And again, they are very powerful moments. They're very bonding moments. And men need them. Men need to be held. Men need to be held. Women need to be held too. We all need to be held. I mean, it's, none of this excludes anybody else. None of this excludes the rights of other people. None of this excludes the emotional rights and needs of other people. But this series is on men. And, I just think this is very central to how I think of, men's needs and men's functionality and men's emotional and psychological wellness. It's very much about that validation of male emotionality. And, the emotional vibrancy and richness, which I mentioned earlier. And look, I want to finish this episode. It's actually ended up staying quite narrow on the idea of crying. But I want to quote. I mentioned an article in last week's episode that I didn't end up particularly coming back to. I'm going to throw a link to it again. It was an article I came across by an American academic called Michael Kimmel, and he was writing about toxic masculinity. It's a really good article. Really kind of captures a lot of stuff very well, and he made some really nice points. And one of them was that masculinity, as we receive it, as it's performed, as we understand it and assess it, that it's homosocial, which means basically that it's other men. It's other men who judge how effective our performance of masculinity is. I mean, this is part of this kind of, a kind of an interpersonal barometer of masculinity that men sort of intuit and understand and receive, where you kind of go assess, that performed masculinity. How tough is this guy? How resilient is he? How funny is he? How smart is he? How sexually potent is he? Very much a concern when you're a teenager. He kissed that girl. He's already doing it. He did this. He did that. There's a real, there's a chart of who's doing well and who isn't, and there's a timeline and who's done what first, before whom, and when, to whom, with whom. I mean, the subject of intense scrutiny and fascination amongst my male friends when we were growing up, much less so now, I can assure you, for lots of different reasons. But in that article as well, Kimmel was talking about how men have a very strong concept and a lot of agreement over what makes a good man and what they receive as being a real man. And I just think, I'm just going to mention it here, maybe this is a precursor to next week's episode, but just listen to this and see what you think. So basically, he says in his article, according to these men, who were consulted for the research, here are the characteristics that men believe make a good man: integrity, honor, being responsible, being a good provider, protector, doing the right thing, putting others first, sacrifice, caring, standing up for the little guy. And what Kimmel says in the article, which I agree with, he says, of course, you'll notice that this is actually what it means to be a good person, which I agree with. And he says, but you might also be surprised at how gendered many men feel it to be. So many men would feel these are very male qualities. And that's often, that's been in my mind over these last few episodes. I would be very much in that camp of viewing, traditionally male qualities, or masculine qualities, or received masculine qualities, strength, stoicism, dominance, power, integrity, leadership, self-sacrifice, protection, provision, caring, caring for the team. I go, well, women are, I would have thought women are equally capable of all of those things, no less capable. So anyway, I've sometimes felt I'm not, and I think, look, if it's not clear, let me reiterate, I'm not positioning myself. I'm not positioning myself as an expert here, not for a millisecond. I'm just bringing my own perspective. I'm trying to reference other people who've done a lot more work in this area. So, again, just trying to be transparent, trying to be clear. So the men, according to Kimmel, they kind of say they take these ideas from, cultural heritage, religious heritage, Western literary heritage, Shakespeare, Homer, it's Judeo-Christian values, and are very consistent with this concept of where their ideas of masculinity came from. And, what's interesting then is the alternative list, the kind of counter list of what ideas come in when they're told this is what we receive a real man is composed of. And so first on that list is never cry. Then we have be strong. Don't show your feelings. Play through pain. Suck it up. Power. Aggression. Win at all costs. Be aggressive. Get rich. Get laid. So, I feel like I received some of those messages directly, indirectly. Some of the young guys or some of my peers who seem to embody those kind of attitudes, I didn't really gravitate towards them. And I was, maybe a bit suspicious of those attitudes. But it's definitely a model that is handed down. It's definitely a model that's received. It's a model that's out there. And again, according to the article, According to the article, Kimmel said men got these ideas from their fathers, from coaches, from their male friends, from older brothers. So, that's a couple of different templates that are laid out there. Now, I think it's notable that in the first list of what they think of as a good man, being emotionally open isn't listed there. Being able to cry or show vulnerability isn't there. So there are still very strong, persuasive ideas out there that imply demonstrating vulnerability, emotion, being able to cry are not especially masculine, and are not maybe desirable as indicators of masculinity. And that brings me to like a further point, which is for many men, masculinity, the concept of masculinity is very much oppositional to femininity. So, and then there's also an implied homophobia in that, where homosexuality is perceived by some men, maybe many men, as being feminine, not masculine. And so there's a sort of this is where you fall into kind of the gender wars or sex wars, chauvinism, misogyny, homophobia, and kind of a weaponized masculinity. So, to cry is to be womanly or to be weak or effeminate, to like certain things. I don't know, fashion. I don't know. Listen, what am I to say? But what I found interesting in another article I came across was, in a survey of attitudes to masculinity, American men very much fell into that camp of, to be masculine is most certainly to be not feminine. And in a corresponding survey in Denmark, that the, Danish men, they put masculinity as oppositional to boyhood or the immature. And I'm not using immature in a derogatory way here, but sort of undeveloped, immature masculinity, boyhood. And I thought that was a really, really interesting distinction. And in fact, in that same survey, Danish men valued their ability to express a more feminine side as something valuable and desirable. So, that appeals to me because that's kind of my concept of healthy masculinity. And, this podcast, of course, is a reflection of my belief in the value of being emotionally open and honest and interrogative, and being willing to explore my interiority, putting myself as the guinea pig again and again, because I think there's real merit in it. I think it has real value. As I've said continually over the history of the podcast, it benefits me, and I'm confident, based on responses I've had from a lot of men who listen to the podcast, that they respond to it very well, that it resonates with them, that it's meaningful to them, that it's helpful to them. So, I'm gonna keep rolling with this to walk the walk, even though I am talking. In this case, I'm talking the walk. So, yeah, I just thought that was interesting, and I really recommend you read that article by Kimmel. And as I said, I'm going to throw in another couple of articles on crying, where you'll read about the historical the historical background of male crying, and the historical contexts and cross-cultural contexts where male crying was very normal, natural, highly approved of, and often extremely public. So, that's interesting as well. The kind of the public use and strategic, arguably, use of male crying in public. But, for me, my position is it's the private crying is really important. like finding a place where you feel it's safe to express. And you know, I'm sharing my story here on the podcast. That's not going to suit a lot of people. And you as the listener are going, you're telling me. Yeah. Anyway, look, that's it. That's plenty. That's another long episode this week. I hope this has been of some use. I had a lovely message on social media from a friend of my wife's, who is the mother to a young man, and she was just expressing her own interest in this subject matter. So, hi Mel, how are you? I hope some of this has overlapped with your own areas of interest or concern, and maybe given you some useful talking points or stepping off points with your son. Yeah. Okay, look, that's it. Let me finish with just saying, spare a thought for the soul of a cat that was once a kitten. A cat that gave us so many great memories and moments. A cat that was adopted by by neighbours who lived about 4 flats across from us, and gave our cat Marlon a different name. We saw her being released from that flat one day and being farewelled with a "See you, Sammy." We're like, that's not Sammy, that's Marlon, that's our cat. What the hell? But cats are so promiscuous. Oh my goodness. They'll get into bed with anyone. They are, little demons. Anyway, farewell, Marlon. Travel safe. What a pleasure it was to have you in our lives. Okay, thank you so much for listening. You can find me on social media in the usual places. Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. The Clear Out is there. And if you really get something out of this and feel like you want to reward me for being a good boy and giving you something nice in your weekly content, you can do so using the Patreon link. That's patreon.com/theclearout. And that would be great. I welcome all positive input, whether that comes in the form of hard money or virtual money that I can then turn into hard money, or just good vibes, nice comments, nice reactions, responses. I receive it all, and I very much appreciate it. Okay, that's it. Until next week, where we will continue with this. I will talk to you then. Stay safe, stay well, mind yourselves. Lots of love, lots of tears. Take it easy. See ya. Bye.